Tonight, as you can see, is going to be about Stonehenge. This, of course, just to remind you, is a series of lectures in advance of the greatest riddle, Will the World Survive? As a result of our exhibition, well, not quite as a result, of our exhibition that opens on the 5th of May, Maya 2012. And for those of you who believe the Maya, well, you've got 1 year and something like 16 days left. So please buy a ticket before the 23rd of December. It's a great pleasure, quite frankly, to welcome Tim Darvill, and it's a particular pleasure to be welcoming him to speak about Stonehenge. Stonehenge is in the county of Wiltshire. I know you're Wiltshiremen, as they say. I come from Wiltshire. Wiltshiremen are known as moonrakers because far back in the late Middle Ages, so it's said, some Wiltshiremen were hiding some treasures, counterfeit treasures, in a pond, and along came the customs and excise. Those of you from Boston will know a little bit about these things. Along came the customs and excise and asked these Wiltshiremen what they were doing, and they said they were raking for the cheese that was in there. The cheese being the moon that was actually silhouetted, or rather reflected, on this pond. So ever since, they've been known as moonrakers. Timothy Darvill isn't a moonraker as such. He comes from the neighbouring county of Gloucestershire. And I've known Tim for a very long time because we were both students of Colin Renfrew, an archaeologist that you may well have heard speak here back in the spring. He studied archaeology, as I did, at Southampton University with Colin, and there he did a thesis on the Neolithic of Wales and the west of England, specialising in megalithic tombs. He knows a great deal about this period, as you'll see. He went on then to run his own business, a consultancy, during the 1980s, and after that he became professor at the University of Bournemouth, where subsequently they've made it into a centre for archaeology, anthropology and heritage. Tim has worked on many different things. He's published a huge number of books, and I'll just give you a flavour of them. Megaliths from Antiquity, the Oxford Guide to Archaeological Science, the Concise Oxford Dictionary of Archaeology, the Archaeology of the Uplands, Neolithic Enclosures in Atlantic Northwest Europe. He's worked on making English landscapes, Neolithic houses in Northwest Europe and beyond, as well as writing a rather distinguished book about prehistoric Britain, and before that, prehistoric Gloucestershire. I should say, though, he is best known in some circles for his rock band, the Standing Stones, as they're called, of which he is the lead guitarist, and maybe you'll be able to elicit more information about that. And for all these very many things, but in particular for his work at Stonehenge, he was made an officer of the British Empire in 2010 in the Queen's birthday honours. But it's to Stonehenge that's drawn him here, and it's Stonehenge which I suspect has fascinated him for all his life. He writes, "I am fascinated by the way that Neolithic farmers established themselves in the landscape, cleared woodland and built great stone monuments. He, with Professor Geoffrey Wainwright, have had the great privilege, the rare privilege, of excavating at Stonehenge. And so when the opportunity came to find someone who knew something about this cathedral from the Neolithic age, there was no one better to ask than Timothy Darvill."
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Richard, for those very kind words of introduction to set us thinking about this. I feel very honoured to be able to come over to Philadelphia and talk about Stonehenge to you this evening, and particularly to be part of a series which includes such matters as King Arthur, the Ark of the Covenant, and the ancient city of Atlantis. Stonehenge, I hope you'll see this evening, is a little bit less of a riddle than perhaps some of those other sites and places and themes that I've just mentioned, and which you'll hear about in later lectures in this series. The site, of course, that I'm going to speak about is 4,000 miles east of here and is, broadly speaking, 4,000 years old. We're talking about a site which is an icon of British prehistory. Indeed, it's probably one of those sites which is recognised throughout the world as representing something of our prehistoric past. Since 1986, it's been a World Heritage Site, and it's attracting something in the order of 1 million visitors a year to have a look around and try to understand something of its context and meaning and purpose. Luckily, people who go there in future will have a much better experience than those in recent years, as we've just heard in the last few weeks that the British government is going to close the road which runs beside Stonehenge, and the visitor centre is going to be relocated to about 2 miles away. So all that's to look forward to. But in the meantime, we've got to think about Stonehenge, its archaeology, and its place in the public imagination. Because Stonehenge is one of those places that actually attracts an awful lot of attention. It's a major feature of what we might choose to call popular culture. We have, perhaps some of you have been there, the Stonehenge Free Festival, which for many years was the largest free rock festival in the world. We have all sorts of strange goings-on connecting Stonehenge to flying saucers and all sorts of other strange beliefs. We see Stonehenge used in advertising. You may not know what this is for, but I'll tell you, it's Renault cars. And of course, those of you who collect pop memorabilia from the past will know of Stonehenge and, of course, Stonehenge lookalikes around the world. It is a theme which crops up time and time again, and it's hard in many ways to spend a day or a few days out and about without encountering Stonehenge in some form or another. And it's culminated recently in a soundbite from English Heritage, who managed the site, telling us that apparently Stonehenge rocks. Well, maybe it does. We'll see. It's also a piece of archaeology, though, that in its own right needs to be explored and understood. It has been central to our interpretations and understandings of prehistory in Europe for many years now, and it's hard to find a textbook about prehistory in Europe which doesn't include some mention of Stonehenge and often includes a whole chapter and lots of pictures. It is very, very important. And over the years, people have come up with all sorts of explanations as to what Stonehenge is all about. If we turn the clock back to the 18th century, William Stukely thought that Stonehenge was a great temple to the sun. And in many respects, what he had to say was perfectly right. If we fast forward to the 1960s, Gerald Hawkins talked about Stonehenge as a great Neolithic computer that would allow prehistoric folks to calculate eclipses, calculate the risings and settings of the sun and moon, as if they needed such a thing. And more recently, Mike Parker Pearson has suggested that Stonehenge is really a place for the dead, a land of the ancestors, a memorialization of people in the great stones at the monument. But what we must recognize is that Stonehenge is in fact an incredibly complicated site. There is almost certainly more than one purpose to the construction that we see when we visit today. It's one of those things that we may assume didn't stay constant through time. And when we put these things together, we start to realize that understanding Stonehenge involves pulling the monument apart and looking at it not only as a structure in its own right, but somewhere which connects with monuments around about, and which connects with the people who built it and where they came from, and which, as I hope I'll show during the course of this evening, connects very closely with the materials which were used to put the monument together. And that's an important theme that I'd like to put with you now and ask you to hold with you as we go along. Let's just start with a little bit of geography, however. I'm going to talk principally about two parts of the British Isles. Stonehenge itself, which you see as the red triangle towards the bottom of the picture on the right-hand side there, and the Preseli Hills, which are around about 250 kilometres away to the west, which you see as the blue triangle over towards the left-hand side there. These two areas we shall jump about between quite a bit, because they are both absolutely important in this story that I'm going to unfold for you this evening. Let's start, though, with Stonehenge itself. In a way, we look at a site like this, we look at a picture of it like this, and we sort of think we know it. And yet it's one of those monuments that the more you look at it, and the more you experience it, the more you have an opportunity to study it, the more you realise that we don't know it at all. It's one of those things that's in our consciousness, but always asking questions, always taking us down new avenues. What we do know, as a result of work over the last 20 or 30 years or so, is that the early stages of Stonehenge involved this earthwork here, which was constructed in 2950, within a year or two BC, 2950. We know that very precisely from a lot of radiocarbon dates that have now been done. At that time, in the centre, there were no stones. It was a flat, open area. There were probably some timber structures inside, and there were certainly some cremations deposited in there as well. It's a very familiar sort of structure, in fact, and here's English Heritage's reconstruction drawing of it at around that sort of time as it's being put together. We also come to understand that this monument is very closely connected with a lot of other structures in the landscape around about. And in particular, structures which we'll come back to later on, which connect this circle with the River Avon. It's about 2.5 miles away. But we'll come back to that articulation later on. Again, let's just keep in our mind that Stonehenge and water are quite important themes in all this. Well, it stayed like this for around about 5 centuries. It was a fairly communal garden sort of monument in many respects, and we have many other examples of structures like this across the British Isles. Here we see perhaps a slightly more formal plan of Stonehenge for those who like those sort of things. We've got the so-called Aubrey holes around the outside, once holding wooden posts, and we've got timber structures on the inside. This is the sort of conventional archaeological map, archaeological plan of these things. And as I say, we've got a dozen or so of these around the British Isles. I'm not going to show you too many of them, but I'll just mention a couple which perhaps underline the point. The first one I picked out because it's got rather an interesting connection. This is at a place called Flagstones in Dorset. It's about 30 or 40 miles from Stonehenge. The house, which is just to the south of Flagstone's house here, was originally Thomas Hardy's house, known as Max Gate. When Thomas Hardy lived there between 1885 and his death in 1928, he couldn't have known that he was living in the middle of a monument that was exactly like Stonehenge. The perverse thing is that it was sitting in his house at Max Gate that he wrote Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which of course ends with a scene at Stonehenge. So there's an interesting little connection there, if you like, riddles in the landscape. That's one in Dorset. Here's one at a place called Llandegai in Gwynedd, which is in North Wales. Exactly the same sort of structure as Stonehenge, built at exactly the same time. It includes cremations, it includes timber structures, and so on. The point that I'm making here is that in its early years, Stonehenge was a very ordinary kind of monument. It was no different from many other things around in the British Isles. What made it special, what gave it a lift, what changed it, was what happened in the years around about 2600 BC. Now, this was a complicated period in British prehistory, and it was a time when lots of interesting monuments were being constructed. This site, for example, at Avebury, was built at just around that sort of time, an enormous, great big earthwork enclosure. You can see here, it too has a stone circle inside it. And very near to Avebury, the largest prehistoric mound that we have in Europe, this site at Silbury Hill, which was constructed about 2600 BC. Again, it's almost as if people were, as it were, challenging each other, as if they were fighting with monuments, as if they were striving to create something which was better, more impressive, more spectacular, more unreal, perhaps, than their neighbours and other people they knew. Something quite competitive was happening in society, and it's at this very same moment that we find across the British Isles, and indeed across northwest Europe, this new kind of pottery, which we know as beaker pottery. This pottery is also associated with the earliest metalworking in the area, first gold, then copper, and then later bronze. And we have on the screen a few of these early objects, a bronze dagger, for example, a gold sun disk, a pair of tress rings from holding somebody's hair in place, and some flint arrowheads of a new style, which also developed at very much this same time. We rather suspect that associated with these things there is an interest in the sun and perhaps a change in the way that people thought about their world. A change which promoted an interest in the heavens and particularly an interest in the movements of the sun across the sky. And it's in the context of these changes, the sort of things that promoted Avebury, the sort of things that promoted Salisbury Hill, and the sort of things which give rise to these new artifact types. It's in that context that Stonehenge develops. And what happens there is quite simply that they start afresh in the centre of the old enclosure by putting up a great stone structure. The ruins of that structure are what we see today. But as we take it apart, and as we think about it, and as we look at it, and as new archaeological investigations help us understand it better, we can come to see that this is not just a single, simple, inspirational construction. What we've got here is a whole series of different elements, and we have to pick them apart a little bit in architectural terms. There's three that I really want to draw your attention to. We've got around the edge a number of other stones, and I'm not going to say much about them, although we will come back to these a little bit later on. It's this central area that I want to focus on for a bit. And here we can see that there is some very large structure, here represented on this reconstruction drawing, and in the centre, and there are some very small structures. Just keep that distinction for a minute. Let's start with the large ones. These are made out of stones which are found locally around Stonehenge. It's known as sarsen stone. It's a very hard kind of sandstone, and it was used to build this outer circle. Interestingly, it contains 29.5 stones, which, if you like riddles, 29.5 is the exact number of solar days in an average lunar month. Perhaps it's some sort of calendrical device. In the centre, we've got these great things, which are known as trilithons, also made of sarsen, and those great trilithons are set up there in pairs, and there's 5 pairs, as you can see, set out here. The orientation of this phase of the monument is very clear through here, and that orientation takes us on to an alignment which to the northeast is the midsummer rising sun, and to the southwest is the midwinter setting sun. So that's a solstical axis built into the form of the monument. Now, once those great stones are put in place, they never move. They are, if you like, the framework of the monument. They are the sinews which structure the monument. And although it's built out of stone, the way that these stones are put together suggests that what they're doing is actually mimicking what is, normally speaking, built out of wood. And indeed, around this time, from other places, we have many examples of timber Stonehenges. We have the timber frameworks, which are represented archaeologically, of course, by post holes, whereas at Stonehenge, we've got a stone version. Here's an artist's reconstruction of one of the timber versions that we know of from not too far away from Stonehenge. So we've got the sarsen stones with their great trilithons and their outer ring. That provides, if you like, the stage, the framework, the building, the structure, the context for what happens inside. And what happens inside is that we've got a whole series of smaller stones, they're shown here in blue, which form an outer circle and an inner horseshoe in its final form, although that horseshoe was originally an oval. And here's a couple of the smaller stones on the side screen there for you to see their shape and size. Now, the important thing about these stones, and they're called bluestones, is that they are not local to Stonehenge. They've been brought to Stonehenge from a great distance away. And whilst we call them bluestones, I'm afraid to say they're not blue. They are stone, but they're not blue. But they are a whole series of different geological types. The bluestones include spotted dolerites, non-spotted dolerites, rhyolites of various sorts, tuffs, and sandstones as well. all of these different kinds of stones are actually different colours. If you want to ask later on why they're called blue stones, we'll address that issue, but archaeologists thought out the word and it's not very good. But it's convenient, like many terms. It's not good, but it is convenient. So they're called blue stones, and we'll refer to them that. But bear in mind, they are not one kind of rock, they are lots of different sorts of rock. Now, it was back in 1923 that it was realised that the bluestones at Stonehenge, in fact, came from the west of Wales. And this gentleman here, Herbert Thomas, was the petrographer working on the construction of geological maps at that time, and it was he that realised that the rocks he was surveying in Wales matched exactly the rocks that he'd seen at Stonehenge. And he then did a whole series of scientific studies to piece that picture together, and subsequently, of course, we've come to do more studies which have not only confirmed his work, but expanded it a little bit. So that we have the source here in the Preseli Mountains, and the place where they're put together at Stonehenge over here. That distance is a distance of 220 kilometres as the crow flies, but as I'm sure you all know, crows don't carry stones. So you have to go a bit further, and therefore you have to go around the coast perhaps, or perhaps all the way around here and up the river. So there's all sorts of options. We don't know which was preferred, we don't know which route was taken, but we do know that the stones were taken by people from here to here, and whilst you'll read occasionally that glaciers perhaps were responsible, there is absolutely no evidence from any glacier that's ever moved in that direction to take those stones. And it was disproved in 1923, and it's been constantly disproved since, although there is a small minority of people who refuse to believe it. It was an achievement. Moving the blue stones was an achievement. These are some experiments from the 1950s with Boy Scouts trying it out on a barge, as you can see, and with rollers and sleds and all that sort of thing. Around about 80 stones were moved in all. The heaviest of those stones weighs approximately 4 tons. So these are not huge stones, and in fact, probably the easiest way to move them is to get a substantial group of people, and I should think the audience here today would be a very good group of people for doing this, and just pick them up and carry them, actually, with some big stretchers. That's the way to do it. Lots of people, lots of effort, and off it goes. Well, those blue stones provide in many ways the challenge to Stonehenge. We understand the local stones, we understand the sarses in the sense that they are local and they are used to build the framework of a monument. But once those blue stones are put inside Stonehenge, all sorts of interesting things happen. And we suspected from earlier excavations that one of the things that happened is that they got broken up very soon after they were put in place. And once they were broken up, new ones were moved or put in place, and then they were moved. And the whole thing was a very dynamic kind of process. And it was that question about the blue stones and how it all worked at Stonehenge that led Jeff Wainwright and I to do an excavation inside Stonehenge in 2008. It was the first time that anyone had been allowed to dig in Stonehenge since the mid-1960s, and it was a great pleasure, but it was a tiny little hole. This is the hole here. We referred to it as keyhole surgery, and I think that's probably what it was. But it is one of those tiny little holes that, positioned just where it needed to be, told us a huge amount of information. We're still working on, we're still processing some of the results from it, but we came to understand that the blue stones were an incredibly complicated phenomenon. What you see here at the end of the excavation is a series of pits, one at the bottom here, one in the middle, and another one up here, which are pits which once held blue stones, but the stones have been extracted and moved and repositioned, and here you can see a blue stone in its secondary position, and another one here, and you'll quickly realise that here's a metre or so of bluestone underground and almost nothing sticking up above the surface. Once this stone was put in place, people started breaking it up and taking bits away. And this becomes a common element of what goes on at Stonehenge. Even this one, which is sticking up 80 centimetres out of the ground now, has got massive, great big flakes out of it. And if you look Here it goes into the ground over a metre underground. So this one too has been broken up. And we can see what they're doing. They're making things with these bits of bluestone. This is the rough out for an axe from our excavation. They were making discs, they were making amulets, they were making all sorts of little knickknacks, we might call them, to take away from Stonehenge by breaking up those bluestones. And we shall come back to that a bit later on. Now, you might expect that, really, once the source was identified down in Preseli, things would get going down there. Well, it's a very rugged sort of landscape. Here it is. This is the area from which those bluestones came. You can see great rock outcrops across the hills here. It's an upland area. It's not very well populated. It's actually quite difficult to work on. But you would expect archaeologists, being a hardy breed, would be down there like a shot to go and investigate the source. Well, I'm afraid to say the only people who went down there were geologists. Very few archaeologists followed up the lead that had been given them by Hubert Thomas. Two who did make the journey, two Peters, Peter Grimes, Peter Druitt, both did a certain amount of work down there and a little bit of excavation, but they never really tackled the big problem of where exactly on the hills those bluestones came from and how they were quarried and what their original context was. And so it's with that question in mind that Jeff and I took ourselves down there back in 2001 in the first instance to start surveying those hills and to look at the context of where those stones came from. Our reasoning was that if somebody was prepared to move 80-odd blocks of stone, 220 kilometres at least, from Wales to Stonehenge, there was something pretty important about those stones. And the answer partly lay at Stonehenge, and I've shown you some of the results there already, and we'll say more later, and partly, we suspect, down in the Preselis. Well, what we found down there was that people had a long and deep interest in stone. People in the Preselis have been messing around with stone for thousands of years before they came to start taking pieces across the Stonehenge. Here's one very strange site down there, for example, which is all about messing around with big pieces of stone. This is the site of Pentre Ifan, and as you can see, they've lifted a huge, great block up into the air. In fact, these uprights supporting it are about 3 metres high, 10 feet. That stone is immensely heavy and has been lifted up. It originally came from here. There's a pit. When it was excavated, there was a pit in the ground. The stone originally sat in that pit. It was dug out and lifted up into the air, like a stone that flies in the sky. And they did this for other stones too. Here's another great big rock at a place called Carn Alw, right on the edge of the Preseli Hills. In fact, the outcrops where the bluestones of the Stonehenge came from is in the distance. Look at this massive block here. This is a 2-metre scale. It's got a ring of earthwork around it. It's got a pit, and it's actually been lifted out of its pit. It's propped up. Bits have been flaked off it. You can see all sorts of flake scars across it where bits of this rock have been taken away back in the ancient past. And here you see some more. This is what we would call prop rocks, where they've just lifted great slabs of rock out of the ground, propped them up with a small stone, and popped underneath burials, pots, little deposits, and so on. Another one here at Carn Shan, this one at Carn Alw, up on the Preseli Hills as well. So this interest, this concern for stone is deeply embedded in the lives of people who were living and working down in the Preselis. And some of them, they made even more interesting by adding what we would call rock art onto those stones. Here's a map of the Preselis, which helps us just think about it a bit more. We've got this central ridge, which we shall say some things about in a minute, and all of these red spots around the outside are areas or places where there are outcrops of rock or pieces of stone which have been decorated with rock art. Now, I have to just put a little warning triangle in the corner of the screen at this point. Don't get too excited. Rock art in the British context is not what you would see in the Paleolithic of France or the indigenous American Indian populations. Rock art in the British Isles is rather more restrained, as you'll see. Here's a fantastic example of it. Here we've got a very nice piece of rock, and just there is the art. What it is a tiny cupule, a cup mark, we would call it, a hollow, a hemispherical hollow, which has been hammered out in the stone. It's one there. We'll see some more in just a minute. But look at this block carefully. Two things about it. One, it's surrounded by a cairn. It's stone cairn in the foreground. And two, it's had a very large plate detached from the original boulder. Now, the position of that rock art there suggests very strongly that there was more on that flake, and they took the flake away because it had rock art on it. As it happens, in the landscape just round about, you find, and this is one we found very near to this site, although it's not the one that came out of that particular rock, you find big flakes with cut marks in them. This 20 centimetre scale, so it's about 35 centimetres across. It's got two cut marks. It's been detached from a big block of rock, just like we saw. This juxtaposition of rock, cut mark, is actually really rather important. But there's many other features down in Preseli which allow us to link the archaeology of that area with Stonehenge. And one of them is the fact that there is a lot of monuments down on the Preselis which map onto and match the sorts of things that we have at Stonehenge itself. There are, for example, quite a few stone circles and also some stone ovals which match what we find at Stonehenge. I'm going to refer to just a couple. We'll look here at a site called Meini Gwyr. We'll look at a site called Gorsvar, and we'll look up here at a site called Bedartha. And those three sites, as you can see, are very close to this central ridge. Bedartha actually stands on it, and we shall come later on to look at this site, which is called Carn Menyn, which is the central site from which these blue stones came. But let's just work our way towards that. Let's start with Meini Gwyr over here. And it's one of those sites that's been explored for a very long time. This is a 17th and an 18th century drawing of Meini Gwyr. And as you can see, it's a stone circle with an avenue leading into it from the outside. It was very nice when William Stukeley went there in the 1700s. I'm afraid if you go there today, it looks rather less good. There's just two stones left, but they are both blue stones. Here they are. But you can see there's a very slight bank, an enclosure bank. And as we do in modern archaeology, once you get the kit out and start surveying this stuff, we find that there is all sorts of things below the ground. This is a geophysics plot using gradiometry to look at magnetic signals below the ground. And what we can see here is that actually there are two rings running through there. Clarify them a little bit with those. There are two rings of stone sockets, one circle of which has been completely removed, the other one very heavily removed, just leaving us with those two stones which are left. You'll remember that at Stonehenge, the bluestone arrangement has a double circuit of stones, two concentric rings. We'll come back to that again a bit later too. There are some very nice stone circles down in Preseli, and if you ever get a chance and haven't done so already, do spend a few weeks or days down there having a look at these things. This is the site of Gorsvar that I mentioned. You can see the stone circle running around here. All of those are dolerites and rhyolites, just like Stonehenge. Their source is up here. And you can now begin to glimpse that this Carn Menyn ridge is quite a dominant geographical feature. When you compare Gorsvar with Stonehenge, well, here's the outer ring of stone to Stonehenge, same scale. Here's Gorsvar, similar sort of thing going on. And we've also got some extraordinary things down in Preseli that we also find at Stonehenge, one of which is what we call stone pairs. Now these, as the name suggests, are literally just pairs of standing stones. And the blue spots on this occasion are the pairs of standing stones. And as you can see, they lie all around the south and the west side of the Carn Menyn ridge. It's almost as if they're gateways, windows, doorways into different worlds. Well, we've got them elsewhere in the British Isles, but as you can see, there's a real concentration of them down here on the Preseli Hills. They are quite simple structures. This is a pair at Ffynnon Mine, and they always stand on a boundary between a flat plateau area and an area of wetland. They always mark the junction between a river valley and a plateau on which monuments tend to be built. Here's another one at Warren Lloyd, and again you can see the Preseli Mass behind Carn Menyn, but here's the gateway stones, the stone pair. And I just showed you the stone circle at Gorsvar. Here's the stone circle. Well, out in the back, there is in fact a stone pair. Here they are, providing a little gateway beyond that. Those of you with good memories will remember that there is also a stone pair at Stonehenge. Perhaps remember this reconstruction drawing. It in fact provides the gateway, the doorway, the window to summer solstice, the rising sun on the summer solstice. When you go there today and you stand in the middle, I'm afraid you don't see the stone pair. We have to put the other one back into place. We know it was there because the excavations have demonstrated its socket, but I'm afraid the second stone has disappeared. What those two stones give you at Stonehenge is not only a gateway between the plateau on which Stonehenge is built and the river valley out to the northeast, but it also acts, if you like, as a gun sight on the horizon, such that when you stand in the middle of Stonehenge on the solstice, the sun will rise in that gap on the horizon between those two stones. And we can compare Stonehenge and Gorsvar in terms of their arrangement, a circle and a stone pair at beyond, focusing attention on the skyline beyond. Just a little bit more to show really this connection between Preseli and Stonehenge. One of the strange aspects of Stonehenge is that in the centre of the monument there is an oval setting of stones. There's very, very few ovals elsewhere in prehistoric Europe, but one of them is right here on Carn Menyn. It's a site known as Bev Arthur. Here it is in the foreground. There's Carn Menyn up behind. And because it's oval shaped, I'm afraid to say you won't find it in many books about prehistoric sites. They're mostly written about stone circles. Prehistoric archaeologists are simple folk. If it's not circular, it's not in the book. This is oval, but it's exactly like a circle. It really is a circle, it just happens to be built a little bit differently, but perhaps with some particular purpose in mind. When we compare Stonehenge here, you can see the similarity with Bev Arthur, 220 kilometres away. The orientation, the general size, the arrangement of stones and so on is very, very similar between these two areas. Now, what all this goes to show is that the monuments that we find in Preseli are of the very same type that we find at Stonehenge. The difference is that in Preseli we find them spread out across the landscape, whereas at Stonehenge we find them concentrated on one particular spot, which happens to be the centre of that earlier enclosure that we spoke about a few minutes ago. So in Preseli, these structures are well spaced out in the landscape and suggest to us that there's some interesting things going on. The focus, though, as we've already seen, is the central part of the ridge running through the middle of the Preseli Hills. And that ridge, well, it's quite complicated in Welsh, but Carn Meini is the plural for a series of stone outcrops. These are cairns, and this is therefore the Meini outcrops. The central one in here is known as Carn Menyn, Menyn being a singular rather than a plural. So the terminology helps us a little bit and is quite important in that regard. But what is even more important is that these rock outcrops are geologically diverse. And just as our bluestones at Stonehenge are geologically diverse, so is this landscape. And it's a complicated old landscape. Luckily, it's one that geologists have been mapping for some time, and here's an extract, a simplified extract of one of their maps. The dark central lines running across are dikes of dolerite. Some of those dolerites occur as cairns, and that's what we were seeing at Carn Menyn and along Carn Meini. Some of them don't, some of them are underground, but we can still trace their positions. To the north, we've got a series of rhyolites, and to the south, we've got a series of rhyolites and tuffs. All of these types, you'll remember, are featured on that list of bluestones that I gave you a little bit earlier on. Now what we find is that the dolerites sit at the centre of this landscape. The rhyolites and the tuffs sit around the outside. They're peripheral. Now, strangely, when we look at Stonehenge, we realise that there are two concentric settings of stones. Let's just remind ourselves. Here's a plan, here's the inner setting, here's the outer setting. Now, when we look closely at the bluestones in these two settings, we realise that there are some interesting differences. In the outer setting, the stones are quite rough. They've been broken up, as I've explained earlier on, but they were never really finished very well. They were just boulders which have been brought from the Preselis and set up here. Moreover, they are of a very mixed lithology. There are lots of different kinds of rock represented around this outer ring. They are especially dominated by the rhyolites and the shales and the tuffs. Here's a couple of them, you can see where they sit on the circle. Contrast that with what happens in the central area, which starts its life as an oval, which we've mentioned already, but gets made into a horseshoe. And here we see some of them. They've been shaped, and all of them are of spotted dolerite. They've been scientifically tested, they're all the same kind of rock, and they are all spotted dolerites. They all came from the same part of the Preseli Ridge, all within a matter of a few hundred metres, not necessarily the exact same spot, but all within a few hundred metres, and they have a very, very homogeneous lithology to them. So let's go back, just to remind ourselves, in the Preselis, our dolerites in the centre of Stonehenge come from the centre of the landscape. The rhyolites and the tuffs come from anything up to 4 or 5 kilometres away around the outside. Very interesting juxtaposition. It's almost as if Stonehenge itself is a microcosm of a real landscape 220 kilometres away. Or you could turn it around and say that real landscape has been transposed in miniature to a spot in Wiltshire. Now, the strange thing is that when you go down to the Preselis and have a look at these things, what you find is that the rocks in the middle there are, in a sense, already like ancient monuments. Here we see some of the upstanding stones, but they are natural. All you have to do is go there and take them away. Just literally rip them off the side of the hill. There is, as it were, a much more blurred distinction between culture and nature. The landscape itself is the same sort of thing as we find in our structure, in our monument at Stonehenge. And when you look at the archaeology, we've been talking hitherto mostly about geology, but when you look at the archaeology, you realise that the central part of Carn Meini, which is that hilltop called Carn Menyn, has been elaborated in the ancient past. And what they're looking for is this kind of stone, which is the spotted dolerite, which is the sort of stone at the centre of Stonehenge. Here's an aerial view of Carn Menyn. This is the highest point, and here you can see an area in the centre there which gives the impression of having been partly cleared of rough rocks. It is the highest point, and you can just make out on this photograph that across here there is a wall. Now this is what field archaeology is all about, finding structures in inhospitable landscapes. The area now shaded red is enclosed behind that wall, and when you go onto the ground you can see that wall as clear as anything. Shall I help you? Here it is. Running through here. It's a very typical style of wall construction for the 3rd millennium BC, where you simply link up outcrops of rock, like this one here, with a line of wall running through, and there's another one just behind, off the edge of the picture there. We did some excavations through it. You can see the quality of it here. It's nicely built, and there's an old ground surface underneath. The pollen and so on from that old ground surface tells us that that wall was built in the 3rd millennium BC, the same sort of period as they were up here mining stones to take off towards Stonehenge. And as you look around the hilltop, you see that it's been quarried for quite a long time. Occasionally you find some recent quarrying, like this iron wedge being used to get stones off. But as you stand around, you see blocks of stone like this, just waiting to be taken off to Stonehenge, if you like. You don't need to do anything. They are just literally falling off the side of the hill, as I explained before. You don't need to quarry them, you just pluck them off the landscape and take them off to Stonehenge. And we find them all over the place. Look at this one here. Here's a detailed shot of it here. This one's been partly shaped, and during that process, it's cracked, it's broken. You can pretty much hear the swearing from the Neolithic people, I think, coming out of that crack as a hard morning's work is turned to naught, and you have to start again somewhere else. They just left it here. And just look at the shape of it, and then compare it with this one, for example, at Stonehenge itself, Stone 62, at Stonehenge. You can see what's going on here. They're taking stones off the hillside, they're crudely shaping them, shipping them off to Stonehenge, and then finishing off the shaping to give you this sort of form, which looks a bit like an axe, perhaps, or some people have even likened it to the silhouette of a person. And the more you look around the Preselis, the more of these things you find. Here's another one, for example, down on Carn Menyn, just by those outcrops, and compare it with stone 45, for example, at Stonehenge, or stone 41 at Stonehenge, and you can see that we've got this pattern very clearly represented. They are quarrying up on these hills and taking the stuff down to Stonehenge. We've actually got some quarries of a different kind up on Carn Menyn too. Here they're taking different kinds of stone out, and here we've got the hammer stones that they were using to break these things up. The Preseli Hills, in the middle part of the 3rd millennium BC, must have been pretty busy places, with stuff being taken off the outcrops, roughly shaped, and taken off to Stonehenge. Now, all of this is very important. It's classic archaeological stuff there. All we've done is described what it is we see. We've described our monuments, we've done our science, we've made our geological connections. We've done what archaeologists do, which is piece together a little bit of the jigsaw of the past. But in a way, it's perhaps a little bit unsatisfying. It leaves us with the question, why? And that, of course, is the question that is on the lips of most people who go to Stonehenge. Why did they build this thing? Why did they bring those bluestones? Why Carn Menyn as the source of those stones? Well, you could take the view, as this cartoonist did, and take a rather sort of negative approach to it and throw up our hands in horror and go and have a drink at this point. But I think really we should try and follow it through a bit more. We've got to take archaeology, and indeed we've got to take our science generally, into the domain of trying to create understandings and interpretations of what it is that we can see. We've got to develop these things on, and to do that, we've got to use a whole load of other sources of inspiration and ideas. And when you look around Stonehenge, and when you look around the Preseli Hills, and when you think about what's been going on, you can come up with all sorts of ideas, and people have. For example, we might imagine that those hills down at Carn Menyn were, if you like, magical places. That somehow those stones were believed to have some sort of energy, some sort of magical powers to them. And we could find plenty of cases around the world of communities who seriously believe that the stones that they know and love have special powers. We might think that there are special acoustic properties to these stones. Well, this is a standing stone down in the Preselis, right on the Carn Meini ridge, and it's in a parish. The parish name is Menyn Quarrying, and in Welsh, Menyn Quarrying means the ringing stone. There are only 2 parishes in Wales with that name, and we know that down to the middle part of the 19th century, there was a stone in this parish which, when you hit it with a stone, rang like a bell. And indeed, acoustic engineers have been around on the Preselis, and they've found quite a few more which do exactly that. So perhaps these stones were considered to be rather special in this way. We haven't yet asked English Heritage to go and play the stones at Stonehenge with a hammer, but perhaps it's only a matter of time before we do that. Maybe that's something we should think about. Perhaps the stones down in the Preselis should be seen as a simulacrum. Perhaps they should be seen as representing other things. They are, as it were, special shapes, and you can probably pick out a couple here straight away. Here's somebody sitting in their bath. There's the head, there's the torso, there's their legs, isn't it? Then, and here's somebody kneeling on the ground, the head, the torso, the legs, and down here. You can see the giants, can't you? The ancestors on the hills. And if you were a prehistoric person, wouldn't those stones be a bit special? Perhaps. Maybe Carn Menyn was the Mount Olympus of the Neolithic world. Maybe this is where the gods lived. Maybe this is their home. Maybe this is the place where the world began. And when we look at that beautiful stone, which seems to have been selected very deliberately as the central stones for Stonehenge, we can perhaps sympathise with this idea. What is this? Is this the first rains that hit the ground? The spots of whiteness? Or is this the tears that were shed by the first great lord of the world as they looked out over the sea and his loved ones sailed off into the other world, or something of this sort? Or is it the case that you're looking here at a reflection of the sky in the earth? Is the sky and the earth coming together on the top of the mountain? Well, all of these things are possible. It's nice to speculate about them, but I'm afraid that is about as far as we can really go with such lines of thinking. They're all interesting, and they all perhaps stimulate some ideas in our imagination, and they might even be true. They might. We've got to perhaps think a little bit more structured, in a more structured way, about this sort of thing. And in that sense, we've got to think perhaps about stone, and about the properties of stone and the power of stone. Because many people in the past, and indeed in contemporary societies, see stones in all sorts of interesting ways. It's not a simple category. It's not simply a scientific category as we might think about today. You see a man here carrying a piece of lapis lazuli out of the quarries down here, up this slope to the top of the hill, and he'll take it to his camp where he works it up into small talismans, jewellery, things that people can take away. This stone weighs approximately 400 weight. Okay, and he's carrying it up that hill. Stone is very important. Stone is crucial to some people. And indeed, we find it talked about amongst some of our ancient and classical writers. Here, for example, is Pliny the Elder, writing in his great natural history of the world, 37 books full of it, in fact. And in the last two, 36 and 37, he deals with the question of stone, he deals with mineralogy, and what he discusses is not the sort of stuff that we might think about stone. He talks about the magical powers, the gender links that different kinds of stones had in their world. He talks about the healing properties that different sorts of stones had for apocryphes of the day. He talks about notions of good health. He talks about healing, and stone is very, very much part of that discussion that he brings to bear. And there's a whole list of all the different properties that different stones have in terms of their medicinal interests. Now, the strange thing is that when we first find Stonehenge being discussed in written records, we find that Stonehenge is discussed in exactly these sorts of terms. The earliest account that we have dates from the 12th century, and it's written by a monk known as Geoffrey of Monmouth. And Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a history of the kings of Britain at this time. Almost certainly, 60 or 70% of what he wrote he made up. Some of it is just fanciful, and it was he that introduced us to Merlin and one or two other famous historical characters. But he was writing at a time when you could perhaps draw on oral histories, when you could draw on folk traditions and legends. And strangely, Stonehenge is the only prehistoric monument in the whole book that he describes. And he talks about it in terms of being created as a memorial to fallen soldiers in a battle. And the book unfolds as a series of dialogues between Merlin the wizard and the king, King Ambrosius at this time, who is seeking to have this memorial built. And the way the discussion goes is that Merlin is charged with creating this monument and decides that what he needs is a monument that already exists in the far west of Britain, which would be transported to Salisbury Plain and form a fitting memorial. Now, there's a number of very strange things about this story. One is that he specifically describes where and how these stones should be brought. He uses magical powers in the end to do it, but he describes where they have to come from in the far west of Britain. He mentions Ireland in particular, but in the 12th century, Ireland and the southwest of Wales were the same cultural province, part of the same area. Until the 1920s, nobody knew that that's where those stones came from. A monk writing in the 12th century could certainly not have known that. The second thing, he says, is that the stones, when they're set up at Stonehenge, have to be set up in exactly the same order as they were taken from their original site. Stonehenge is a microcosm of the landscape from which those stones derive. A monk in the 12th century could not possibly have known that, and we've only known it for about 8 years. So we've got two things that he says which science has demonstrated to be correct over the last few years. So we might ask ourselves, what about the third thing? Well, the third thing he suggests is that the reason that these stones were brought is because they were believed to have healing powers. Here you see a little quote just to give you a flavour of the discussion. "Try not to laugh in such a foolish way, Your Majesty," answered Merlin. "What I'm suggesting is nothing ludicrous about it. These stones are connected with certain secret religious rites, and they have various properties which are medicinally important." It's a powerful statement. In fact, he says it twice in the dialogue. This, Stuart Pigott argues, is oral tradition, written down by the first people who were writing anything at all in this part of northwest Europe, by the monks, writing their histories, writing their stories, writing their chronologies. It's an interesting thing, especially as he then goes on to tell us how it works. And what you have to do is create a pool by the stones, fill it with water, and use that water as curative magic water. So the stones and the water are joined together in this process. We might take this idea and just ask a little bit about the archaeology. Well, if we go down to Preseli, first of all, for a minute, we find that our bluestone outcrops are very closely associated with springs. And where we find those springs, we find that the springs have been dammed up to create pools. Here's one, which is called Ffynnon Beswch, and here's a wall built across the little valley. Here's the spring where I put the ranging rod, and this is the pool at the base of this cliff. Ffynnon Beswch means the spring to cure the cough. Interesting. Just at the top here, there is a prehistoric cemetery. Here it is planned out as part of our researches, a series of cairns with burial cists in them. They're typical of the period around the end of the 3rd millennium BC, and one of them, just here, has a curb which has a decorated stone in it that you see here, rather like the ones we saw earlier on. This connection between water, stone, death, cemeteries, and so on is a very close one. I'm not going to bore you with too many examples, but here's another one immediately below Carn Menyn. That broken men here I showed you is just up here. Here's the spring, here's the wall running across, the raging rod is stood in the pool, and this stone here has rock art on it. Again, it's the spring which takes us back to the right sort of period in the prehistoric past. And we can follow this story on through. Certainly these springs are still held in special regard in southwest Wales as having healing properties, and if you go there you do in fact find little inscriptions sometimes from people who have been there quite recently for exactly that purpose. But we also find that along, broadly speaking, the Bluestone Trail, as I've called it here, is a number of other stones which are regarded as having this same property, and they're all bluestones. I'll show you a couple. Here's St Tylo's Well. It's surrounded by bluestones, and the tradition is that to cure ailments, you must drink the water from here in the skull of a human being. Use a human skull. That skull is here, in St Landolph's Cathedral in Cardiff. It's still there. I'm itching to get it radiocarbon dated, but that's for another day. St Tylo's Well is right at the base of the Preselis. Here's another one. This is Llandegai West, little church, not too far from the Preselis, about 20 miles just along the coast. Here we have this stone. It's a bluestone. It's a piece of spotted dolerite. It's got this lovely little seat carved in the top. It's known as Carner's Chair. It's right beside what's a relatively modern church, but in the churchyard is a spring. And the idea is that you sit on this stone, you drink the water from the spring, and you're magically cured of your ailments. Well, you might say it's not a very ancient church, and the stone perhaps has been moved and so on, but a piece of work not by us, but by another group entirely, the Difford Archaeological Trust, discovered the church and the stone, which is just in here, sits inside an ancient enclosure. And they've done a whole series of surveys. This is an air photograph, this is a geophysical survey. The church is actually in a prehistoric enclosure. The church has adopted, if you like, an ancient site. And here's another one. This is the Colmer Stone at Newport. This is Ascension Day, 1770, and the trick is to go and lie on this stone inside the church. It's still there, here it is, and this will cure your ailments. And I don't think anyone goes to do it today, but certainly they have in the recent past. And if we go to Stonehenge itself, we find that this story of breaking off bits of the stones to use as talismans and amulets for healing is very powerful. Here's a couple of nefarious-looking guys doing exactly that back in the late 18th century. And when the site was acquired by the state in 1901, one of the first things they did was to ban people taking hammers to it to break off bits as lucky charms and talismans. So this is something which takes us right down into the modern period. Now, we need to explore a bit more about Stonehenge. We need to think a bit more about this because it's a very tempting and very powerful thought. The first thing we might just notice is that Stonehenge, as I asked you to remember earlier on, is very closely connected to water. Here's Stonehenge, here's an avenue which leads 2 miles or so down to the River Avon. Stonehenge, just like the sites in the Preselis, is very closely associated with water. But I expect you're asking, what about these bits of stone which are broken off at Stonehenge? Where do they end up? Do we know anything about their context and how they were used? Well, we know they were made into axes and amulets and discs and all this sort of stuff, and we can see that happening. The archaeology of the site that we excavated shows us that. But we also find that bits of bluestone from Stonehenge end up in burials around Stonehenge. And to just take a plot here, here's in the coloured dots some burials just around Stonehenge itself, which have got pieces of this bluestone broken off Stonehenge itself and placed in the graves. The more we look, the more we find, and the more it's tempting to start to link these things together. But before I show them, I just need to preface these comments by saying we've got to think ourselves out of the modern world for a minute. We've got to ask ourselves what healing, medicine, healthcare would have been like in the 3rd millennium BC. It doesn't work like the emergency room scheme that you have here or the National Health Service schemes that we have back in the UK. What we're talking about is very different attitudes towards this, but nonetheless, an attitude which involves looking after people and taking care of those who are not at all well. But when we look at these burials, we see some quite interesting patterns. Here, for example, Amesbury G51 is one such thing. Here we've got a robust adult, and he had a beaker pot with him. And this little piece of bone here is very distinctive because it's a trephination out of the top of somebody's skull. That little piece of bone has been cut out of somebody's head whilst they were alive. And it represents an early case of surgery, if you like. You don't do those sort of things lightly. This is somebody who was pretty unwell to succumb to this kind of treatment. With this person was a piece of rhyolite from Stonehenge. Here we're at Stonehenge itself. In the ditch, in the upper fill of the ditch, is a burial of an adult male in the prime of life. This adult male was killed by 3 arrow shots. And the arrows are still embedded in the skeleton. Here we are, around about 2000 BC. With that skeleton, in the grave, were 3 pieces of dolerite stone chipped off one of the uprights of the stone. Dolerite and rhyolite. 3 arrows, 3 pieces of stone. Here's another one, Avebury G71. I hope I'm not putting anyone off their dinner as we go into this little discussion. An adult male again, under a flint mound. This is where the individual was found. Here's the poor fellow's skull. And you might at first think this is another case of trephination. We've got a big hole in the back of the head. Unfortunately, it's not trephination in this case. It's somebody who was beaten over the head by a blunt instrument, who then had treatments for the removal of the bone splinters. Bone grew back. But this is somebody who was very badly beaten across the back of the head, perhaps in war, in battle, or something of that sort, and survived for long enough for the bone to continue to grow back over that hole. Now, I don't know what prehistoric medicine is like, but I would suggest to you that it's something like we're seeing in these pictures. The combination of stone plus people who are desperate is the sort of thing that you see going on here. This individual doesn't have any stone with him, but it is a celebrated find. It's the richest grave that we have from the Beaker period in northwest Europe. Dates to just about 2200 BC. You can see some of the things, 5 beakers. There are lots of things buried with this person. The person himself, though, had 2 very severe injuries. One was to his left leg, and his knee was completely missing. The likelihood is that it was a riding accident or something of that sort, and he spent a good part of his life limping. That, though, is not what killed him. What killed him was something to do with his teeth and an abscess developing in his jaw, and the forensic folks who have examined his skeleton believe that it was blood poisoning which finally did for him as a result of this abscess in his mouth. The extraordinary thing is that this guy didn't come from anywhere near Stonehenge. This guy was born somewhere on the edge of the Alps and travelled to Stonehenge later in life, after his knee had been very badly damaged and before he succumbed to this difficulty with his abscess. So we've got here some interesting things. We're progressing with research. There's a lot more yet to do. But what it's showing us already is that there is a connection between water, between bluestones, between Stonehenge, between amulets, and between people who, although we find them as dead bodies, in life went through some pretty serious trauma towards the end of their lives. So what we're left with is this extraordinary site in Wales, Carn Menyn, at the centre of a landscape which provided 80 or so blocks of stone, which were then transported 220 kilometres across the Stonehenge. These things in the Preselis were closely associated with springs. In Wiltshire, we've got Stonehenge sitting in the centre of a landscape, now with a microcosm of a Welsh landscape represented in stones, connected also to water via the avenue, and sitting in the centre of a distribution of monuments where people lived, where they worked, where they went about their everyday lives, but which Stonehenge was the central point, the focal point. Looked at in this sort of way, I would suggest, we see that Stonehenge has in it both an active and a passive element. The Sarsen stones, this is, I think, rather a fun drawing from the early years of the 18th century, the Sarsen stones provide, if you like, the architectural framework. They provide the structure, the building, if you like. No doubt those stones were replete with symbolism. Perhaps they were an ancestral god or gods. Perhaps they were there to create a calendar, a time-reckoning system of some sort. But most importantly, they created a ceremonial precinct in which were set up these imported stones from Wales. Now, I think it would be naive to imagine that Stonehenge ever had a single or an unchanging purpose. But one of the roles that I think Stonehenge had, and which I would argue very strongly had, was that it was some kind of shrine that was celebrated as a ceremonial centre, a place perhaps of pilgrimage for people coming from round about, in the hope that their ailments, let's call them that, slightly euphemistically perhaps, but their ailments would be cured. It's the same sort of thing as we see in medieval times happening, for example, at Santiago de Compostela, where pilgrims of all sorts of abilities and all sorts of ailments go very long distances in the belief, in the hope that they will be cured. It doesn't have to work, people only have to believe it. And that, in a sense, is the really important thing about Stonehenge. It's not a claim that Stonehenge is a centre for healing. It's a claim that Stonehenge was believed to be such a place by prehistoric people. I've no doubt that some of those stones and some of those structures represent great deities, perhaps gods of the sun, gods of the moon, and that these gods presided over the ceremonies and the events which happened there. Maybe we see in those trilithons representations of some of those great deities. But the stones, I would suggest, are not simply memorials to gods or ancestors or people, but those stones and those gods, if you like, were active agents in the lives and in the well-being of the people who actually went there. And what we're beginning to do here is to glimpse that perhaps Stonehenge and the Preseli are linked in very active ways. And it's the stones which provide the answer. In that sense, I think this is not the end of the road for thinking about Stonehenge. It's not the end of resolving a riddle about Stonehenge. But what it is the beginning of a phase of research which is beginning to lead us to think about Stonehenge in entirely new and different ways. Thanks so much for listening.
I think you'll agree with me, it's a wonderful talk. As a Welshman, I couldn't have imagined why he was in Wales to begin with. But that's the kind of prejudice that Welshmen have. Tell me, Tim, we're going to have a few moments for questions. Please, I beg you, if you want to ask a question, please use the microphone because we'd like to record it. So I'll ask the first question while you identify where the microphones are. There are other great hinges around about. What was their role?
We've got about something like 60 hinges in Britain, but none of them have got stones in the centre which have been brought any great distance. They are all the simple earthworks, sometimes with a simple stone circle. They are, if you like, all the buildings which are the ceremonial places, but none of them actually have this power which the blue stones at Stonehenge give it. And I think that's the really important thing. Stonehenge is like many other sites, except for the way it actually worked.
Would you say something about the race or ethnic group of people that were there around 3000 BC or at 2600 BC?
Yeah. The question was, could we say anything about the race or the ethnic nature or the ethnic origins of the people there around 2600 BC? It's quite a tricky issue on a number of grounds. One is we would need first to establish which people were local and which people had travelled to the area. And the Avebury Archer shows us that we must be very careful about deciding who is local and who's not. If we can, and when we can, filter out the local people, then we've got opportunities these days using DNA to start to work out what their relationships are. The preliminary work, and it is only preliminary work, which has been done on British prehistoric populations, is that we have 3 DNA-based genetic groups. One of those groups lives more or less in the west of the British Isles, and their closest connection in terms of their genetic makeup is with Iberia. A second group live in the southeast of Britain, and their closest genetic material relates to northern France and Belgium, like the Rhine. And the third group, which occupies the area more or less, is found in the area more or less from East Anglia up the east coast of Britain into eastern Scotland, has very, very close genetic links with Scandinavia and particularly with the Baltic areas. And that is at the moment the state of play in terms of where we think those Neolithic genetic groups fit.
Just to follow up, is Celtic mentioned in these groups, or is that a later invasion?
Is Celtic mentioned in these groups, or is it a later invasion? It's not an invasion at all. The Celtic question is a huge one. Perhaps you should have it a riddle for another day, I think. The Celtic question is a big riddle because, of course, Herodotus didn't know where the source of the Danube was, and that's the real problem. And he put it in the wrong place. He thought that the Celts lived at the head of the Danube, which he thought was in Central Europe. The place he was actually thinking of is now well established as being in Iberia. That's where people that you might choose to call Celtic, although it's not a very useful term in archaeology, come from.
I guess that's a great segue, because I just wondered, is there any connection or any similarities with Newgrange, Brunaboyne, outside Dublin?
Yeah, that's a really good and important question. The question of the connections with Newgrange. Newgrange is built in this episode of what I sometimes call fighting with monuments. People are doing ridiculous things by building ridiculously large monuments. You don't need passage graves that big. You don't need stone circles like Avebury, which are that big. And it's part and parcel of a tradition which includes northern France and the British Isles of doing ridiculous things with monuments. Conspicuous consumption is sometimes called, but that's rather a pretentious term for it.
Is there any evidence of commercial dimension to any of the archaeological findings around Stonehenge or any of the other stone groupings?
Commercial in the prehistoric period?
Yes, any evidence of commercial dimension to this activity?
Yeah, it's a curious thing, isn't it? Because we've got then to explore the question of intentionality, why people do this. And we can use, if you like, anthropology and ethnography to help us a little bit with that. There's a big anthropology of what's sometimes called shrine franchising, where you take a shrine, a ceremonial centre, and you give it some special importance or power. A piece of stone or the bone of a saint or something like this. And you can see it happening in medieval Europe, you can see it happening in parts of Africa and so on. It's fairly common practice. What inevitably happens is that that place, if it takes off, has economic importance. If it takes off, has great social importance, and it inevitably develops a wealth. Now, whether that's financial wealth or a wealth of knowledge or understanding or experience or a wealth of social culture wrapped around it is perhaps more difficult to say. And you might say, well, all of these things just overlap with each other. So perhaps rather than using economic in a purely monetary kind of way, if we thought of it in terms of wealth, which could be cultural as much as monetary or economic, then yes, these places do develop a real prestige of their own. And I've absolutely no doubt that Stonehenge developed that prestige and that people knew of it literally all over Europe. I think that Amesbury archer heard about this a long, long way away and came up to Stonehenge during the course of his life. As it happens, he probably brought his nephew or his brother with him, because we've got that burial as well.
There is evidence in other places that thermal waters do have some healing properties. Is there any evidence for these stones or these pools of water that have anything really healing?
Yeah. Does this water have anything special about it? Well, the strange thing is that the waters in Britain, which are considered to be the most therapeutic, are the most pure. And as it happens, that Preseli water is very pure. Some of the best known springs for therapeutic purposes, like those at Malvern, for example, have almost nothing by way of trace elements and so on in them. There is a few trace elements. We've done a lot of water analysis, as you would imagine, and there is a little bit, and generally speaking, those chemicals like sulfur and so on are quite helpful, but the proportions, the concentrations are not great. But it is typical of the healing springs in Britain that the most highly regarded are actually the most pure.
Any further questions? You've dazzled them, Tim. Oh, no, there is.
Here we are.
Following up on the water question and how in nature the bluestones were found around springs, have you ruled out that there was any constructed, if not natural, pool within Stonehenge?
We haven't ruled that out, and it is still a possibility, in fact, that there are some sort of pools at Stonehenge. I think probably what they were doing was using ceramic vessels, perhaps, or even leather vessels and so on. Water was clearly important, but it perhaps didn't function in quite the same way as it did in the Preselis themselves, where, if you like, that was the origin of that tradition. But it's pretty easy to see how even at Stonehenge, if, for example, you broke bits off and put them in water, you could drink it or wash yourself with it or something of that sort. And perhaps the point I'd like just to re-emphasize is that what you see at Stonehenge now is not just the eroded carcass of what was a hugely important monument. That's the case for the Saracens. But when you look at the bluestones, what you're looking at is something which has been hammered and bashed and bits taken away for thousands of years. And that is not just, if you like, natural erosion and not just the natural decay of the monument. What we're looking at when we see that is actually part of how that monument worked.
This is perhaps in left field, but do you know of any relationship between Stonehenge or the henges in Britain and the arrangements, the alignments in Carn Alw in Brittany?
The question is whether there's any relationship between Stonehenge and the Carn Alw alignments in Brittany. Well, the Carn Alw alignments, as we currently understand them, are considerably earlier, by probably 2,000 years. The Carn Alw alignments are 5th millennium BC, so between 5,000 and 4,000 BC. Stonehenge is 3rd millennium BC, so between 3,000 and 2,000 BC. So there's quite a big disjunction there. But having said that, the interest in stones, the creation of stone enclosures, is a very long-standing tradition that we find in these cultures. So there may be some very distant connection, but it's not a direct correspondence.
Two last questions, these two gentlemen.
Yeah.
Is there any speculation that any of the Stonehenges may have had a military connection?
Any military connection? Military connection? No, I don't think so. No, not that we can see.
Well, I think it's been established sometime, several thousand years ago. Greenland actually was green. And the question is basically, what was the weather like when this was constructed, and did it have anything to do with what was going on?
Yeah, it's a very nice question about the climate. It's one of those things we often forget about in archaeology and sort of dust it to one side a bit. The period from about 3000 down to about 1500 BC was a period of climatic optimum in northwest Europe, and it's that time when they gradually extend agriculture right up into the highest hills. And the very highest cultivation that happens in the British Isles takes place around about 1600, 1700 BC. That's when they get to the highest point. So basically the weather has got to be drier and warmer to get up into the mountains to cultivate land at that time. And it's building up, therefore, during exactly the period that we're talking about. So it's drier and it's warmer than it is now, but not that much at the time that Stonehenge is being built. That accelerates as we go through into the 2nd millennium BC, and then it deteriorates again during the later part of the 2nd millennium. I don't think it's a driver in creating something like Stonehenge, but it is interesting just to see the long-term pattern of change that goes on.
There's a lady there who, one last question.
I'm dying to know as a practical question, what are they doing to protect Stonehenge? We were here many, many years ago when it was not under fence, and then we went and saw it very sadly under
Okay. The question was, what are they doing to protect and preserve and better present Stonehenge? I'll be very brief, if I may, because it's a long and big story. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of things happening just at the moment, and there's two really important aspects to it. One is that they have just announced in the last couple of weeks that they are going to close the main road, which cuts through the edge of the site. Okay, that's going to be stopped off, and you won't be able to drive along it anymore. At the same time, they're going to take away the visitor centre, which is there at the moment, which we all recognise is pathetic, and transport it 2 miles away at the end of the road that's going to be closed, basically. And they have now designed a new visitor centre with a new car park and a new display area. There'll be material from Stonehenge on display. There's going to be some reconstructions. And you'll either be able to walk, if you so choose, it's about 2 miles, or you'll be able to take an electric train, which will take you to near Stonehenge, not to it itself, but to quite near to it, and then you'll be able to walk. Now, I suspect the question perhaps in your mind is, will you be able to go inside Stonehenge again? And this is causing a lot of debate at the moment. The word from English Heritage that I heard about 10 days ago at a meeting was that they didn't foresee that being possible. But I have to say, there are a number of us, and I count myself as one, who think that is not a satisfactory position, and that we need to find a solution to that. The solution I've suggested, and if you want to write to English Heritage and suggest something similar, you're very welcome to, is that because the visitor numbers peak during the year at around Easter time and in August, they are very high at those times. It may not be possible for everybody to go in at that time. But the other 10 months of the year, the numbers are more modest. And I think at that level, they could go inside Stonehenge. So my suggestion is that for certain periods of the year, people turning up would be able to go inside Stonehenge. But we would have to accept that at peak times, that may not be possible. So you'd have to time your visit, basically, if you wanted to go inside in a sort of free roaming kind of way. You can, at the moment, book a visit. You can go in the evening or in the morning, and you can book a visit, but you need 2 or 3 months' notice